Well, joining me from Dunedin is Robert Patman, Professor in International Relations at Otago University. Well, first of all, Professor Patman, thanks again for joining us. The Syrian government says it regrets the end of the mission. That would suggest it was a reasonably useful diversion for it.
Well, it may confirm the suspicion that it provided some sort of political cover for the Syrian regime, and there's no doubt about it. Operationally, the Arab League mission has been a disappointment, not least for the protesters who wanted more protection. However, diplomatically, as the previous comments suggest, the Arab League, having tried to use a regional solution to the problems of Syria and having to fail, they've effectively admitted they failed now, provides the way, I think, to internationalise the problem.
Before we get to the issue of the Security Council, do you think that the mission actually achieved anything?
Not a lot, but the Arab League have not been involved, Gordon, in this sort of activity before, and I think it is something of a diplomatic catalyst. It's not been a consolation in terms of the operational situation. What we've seen, as was indicated, something like 200 people have been killed in the last week alone, and so the violence has escalated. But it's important because we now have an Arab interpretation of what's occurring in Syria, and they're saying quite categorically, the head of the Arab League, the Secretary General, has said in the last couple of hours that they do not accept the Syrian government's explanation that the opposition are terrorists. He said by and large they're innocent civilians who've in the end have to arm themselves. So that's important because I think if this problem is going to be internationalised, you do need regional support for any solution that's adopted in the UN Security Council.
Yes, the Arab League has hardly had a reputation for being a dynamic player. Is it suddenly growing a spine?
Well, I wouldn't quite go that far, but it certainly, there are those, the Gulf states, for example, the Prime Minister of Qatar, who've wanted a more proactive approach from the beginning. And the fact that the Gulf states withdrew from the Arab League mission earlier in the week, I think has now put pressure on the Arab League as a whole to actually go to the Security Council and say, what can you do to help us? Because clearly we have not been able to deliver a regional solution.
Well, let's move to that action in New York. Russia is preventing the Security Council as it stands from passing a resolution critical of Syria, urging Assad to step aside. Will this pressure from the Arab League help to break down that Russian intransigence?
Well, I think both the Syrian regime itself, but also Russia, are under enormous pressure now. But it's not just Russia. China has also, both China and Russia, effectively vetoed an earlier draft resolution in the Security Council back in October when members of the Security Council wanted to take a tougher line with Assad. Now that the Arab League is making, on Tuesday, the head of the Arab League will be making a request to the UN Security Council, of which Russia is a member, it will be more difficult, I think, now for Russia to be defiant, because it always said that Western countries shouldn't actually breach the sovereignty of Arab countries. With the Arab League saying, yes, it should, that puts Russia in a defensive position. I think it's watch this space, Gordon. I think Russia could well adjust its position in light of new developments.
Makes it much harder for it to be seen as an Anglo-American initiative, doesn't it? Now, do we, from this distance, risk overestimating the genuine opposition to Assad? The Christians, the Alawites, Assad sect, are clearly strongly in support of him still.
Well, I think you're right to raise this question because I don't think it's just the regime versus the rest. The regime draws on the Alawites as its key constituency. They're about 3% of the population. But the regime also calls on support from other minority groups, the Druze and the Kurds and Christian groups. I think at best they could probably call on about 30% support. But what is clear is that the violence they have engaged in has actually offended some of their support. And I think the appalling level of violence that the Syrian regime has inflicted certainly has galvanised the opposition. For example, a lot of the Sunni Muslims were a little bit ambivalent when the protests first started in March last year, but they now, I think, are galvanised. Not only that they've ruled out the possibility of reconciliation with the Assad regime, it's now regime change they want.
But I note a poll reported in The Guardian recently, a Qatari poll, noting more than 50% still favoured Assad staying in power, if only to avoid sectarian civil war.
Well, that is I think, a real concern that many people have in the country. Having said that, I think many people are increasingly recognising, particularly in the events of the last week, where you had something like 200 people killed, most of whom unarmed civilians. I think a lot of people are recognising that the Assad regime has essentially forfeited any legitimate right to carry on. And so the Arab League plan was for him to hand power on a transitional basis to his vice president, which he, of course, rejected. So it doesn't seem to be any easy way out of this crisis, and I think international pressure could play a crucial role.
Robert Patman at Otago University, thank you once again for your time.